Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Senate Education. It's Wednesday, April 7th at 1:32 p.m. We are going to start by continuing our conversation on H26. This has become known as the school construction bill. We're then going to return to the conversation we started last week around career and technical education funding. We had a request from that group, and we're going to pull that apart a little bit. And then I've had conversations with both Senators Balint and Starr about S100, and I think we may have a path forward on that given yesterday's discussions. And so I'd just like to have some committee discussion and get a sense of if we can maybe move forward with an idea that we've talked through about maybe doing part of that bill. And then S114, Ms. Myers and Rep. Webb are available at 4, and they are, I've asked Ms. Myers to respond to some of the work that the House has done on this bill, and then Representative Webb will also give some of her thoughts as we make our way through literacy. So not seeing any questions at this moment, I think we will jump in. Welcome, Mr. Secretary, and Mr. Chair, great to have both of you with us.
Good afternoon.
And we are looking at H426, and one of the things that I know that we, and Ms. Ryan, welcome again, we had talked about was to have the State Board and the Agency of Education have a conversation around how best to move forward with regard to the responsibilities put forward in H426. In other words, where certain work will fall. And I'm wondering, I'm looking to really the three of you to help guide that conversation a little bit based on your conversations. So, Mr. Secretary, is something you'd like to start with?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, Dan French, Secretary of Education, and joined by Cassandra Ryan, and one of our subject matter experts on the school construction program as we once knew it and as we know it today. On your specific question, Mr. Chair, I have submitted written testimony, and I try to address that sort of in the beginning. The Chair of the State Board, John Carroll, and I are in agreement that there's a portion of 426 that speaks to appropriating a sum up to $100,000 to update the standards on school construction, and we're in agreement that that should be done by the agency. So one of my first recommendations in my written testimony is, yes, we agree with that work, but 2, that the appropriation should be designated to the agency instead of the State Board.
Okay, great, easy. And any particular reasons for the shift? It passed out of the House with the State Board. If you could just give us a little bit of help us again to understand that, just for even our own learning purposes here.
Yeah, I think, anyone in Vermont, and even Cassandra, who's been on this topic for far longer, and I've been on the receiving end of this, and having been a superintendent that's implemented several projects. I think we'd struggle to understand the origins of the current regulatory language. We assume, as I think everyone's aware, that at one point the agency had 3 FTEs working on this. So we assume at some point that the agency had some expertise, technical expertise in this area that was utilized to help the board develop these regulations. But it's not clear to us the exact origin. So I'm not sure how this ended up going forward the way it did. We did not testify necessarily in support of this approach, and bulk of my testimony today is really about the COVID context relative to school facilities improvement, which is more or less the same testimony I provided in the House previously. But I think if the issue of updating is something you want to focus on, then I think it would be more appropriate to designate those funds for the agency to contract out, and then our expertise or the contracted expertise would be utilized by the State Board in development of rules.
Mr. Carroll.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, my name is John Carroll, Chair of the State Board of Education. The Secretary and I do concur that responsibility for the development of what's called the capital outlay financing formula which is specified in H 426 as being assigned to the state board, and which, as I think I explained to you a week ago, I had advocated for, but the board, I think quite wisely, urged me to engage with the secretary to see if they could take that over. The reason being, of course, that it's a highly technical matter. The board has no employees, no expertise, um, and the agency either has or hopefully will develop, historically certainly has had staff who are knowledgeable about construction and who can oversee this work. And just by way of sort of why did it happen this way, I think the House acted completely appropriately in the sense that the rules regarding construction, school construction, like virtually all rules, are the duty and responsibility of the state board to develop with guidance and assistance from the agency. And this thing called the capital construction financing formula, which is listed in Part 2B of H 426, is stipulated in the rule as being the duty of the state board to update annually. And quite frankly, it's not been updated in 8 years. So that's why it came to be this way. But on further reflection and consultation with the state board and with the secretary, aware and concurrence, the number that I had recalled was $100,000 in connection with the capital construction financing formula being the estimate for the consulting assignment that would have to be contracted out with an architectural firm. The secretary mentioned 200,000, but I'm not sure if possibly that's for a broader scope of work that I'm not familiar with.
If I said 200,000, I misspoke. I have 100,000 in my testimony.
I see. Thank you.
So, Ms. Wasserman, would you, if you wouldn't mind, starting to make a list of edits and amendments that we will consider as a committee, including this one? Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, please.
If it's appropriate, I'd like to go through my written testimony a bit and just share you some thoughts, which are largely, again, in context, certainly informed by some work that's been going on for several years now with a group of superintendents and school facilities professionals, including some school architects in the state. But also what's really informed my thinking in the last 6 months or so on this has been our experience with COVID-19, and particularly how that pertains to improving school facilities issue, particularly as school facility issues pertain to safety and health concerns, which are a permissible or allowable use of the federal funds that we have before us. So just basically following my written testimonies and outline, we've already discussed this item around updating the standards and the capital outlay financing formula. I would also make the point that I think there's a need to update the regulatory framework, or excuse me, the statutory framework for school construction. I think this issue emerged from our conversation in the advocacy groups about basically just leaving the statutory framework intact. But I've made the point on several occasions that I think the statutory framework needs to be revisited as well. Firstly, as often cited, the Massachusetts process and experience with school construction. Like many states, Massachusetts has a sliding scale for reimbursement. Our current statutory framework just provides a across the board 30% reimbursement for any school construction project. I would suggest again that the statutory framework needs to be visited as much as the regulatory framework. And I would recommend a school construction aid process that incorporated communities' relative value in their grand list as well as student enrollments. But I think perhaps more importantly, there needs to be some emphasis on policy objectives. And this gets to the heart of what's the state's interest, in my view, in regulating school construction other than to provide additional financing. But I think we all agree that the quality of school facilities is directly related to the quality of education. And the state therefore has an interest in ensuring that school facilities meet sort of minimal standards, not just safety and health standards, but also educational standards. So sort of based on a perspective of, let's say, Act 46, but some of the governance work we've been doing across the state, and certainly in reaction to the very real demographic challenges the state is facing, both in student enrollments, but also perhaps more importantly now in staffing issues and staff availability. I think there should be some emphasis on policy criteria before we continue to make investments in school facilities. And in particular, I've observed, firstly, there should be a commitment to supporting elementary schools for the youngest students, as close to those students as possible, physically or geographically as close as possible. Those students aren't necessarily able to travel as far, but we need to have a priority on also getting students off to a good start. And I think that means a policy commitment to small schools, small elementary schools in particular, probably beyond what we've envisioned as a small schools grant, if you will. But then secondly, I think an emphasis, particularly at the middle level, on regionalization. We've done quite a bit of regionalization at the high school level, like many rural states. But we still have a lot of K-8 schools in the landscape. And I think in particular, if we were to subject those schools to a scrutiny relative to education quality standards, we'd find that they're deficient as enrollments have declined. In particular, it's, I think in terms of the sciences and the arts, we're finding that many of those programs are struggling with attracting adequate numbers teachers and qualified teachers, precisely because they don't have adequate number of students to sustain the program. So I think the pressure from the demographic challenges should be interpreted from a education policy perspective as really revisiting the regionalization of middle level programs. And accordingly, again, I think there should be some incentivization, if you will, with school construction around policy objectives in education. So the last piece of that on section 2, I just point out there's a cost threshold for bidding in the law in a different section of law, 559. That's $15,000. Basically, when school districts encounter a project that costs more than 15,000, they're required to go out to bid. I don't believe that threshold's been examined in many, many years, and I think is sort of out of sync with what real costs are today. So I just picked a number out of the air, and I would suggest that number be increased to $40,000. Might support districts being able to move forward a little more quickly in some of these projects. I've heard that concern from business managers and superintendents, so I thought I'd bring it in here today for you to consider. Second section of this H 426 speaks to the needs assessment, which was something I was advocating last year. I think it was a good starting point of how do we wrap our arms around this idea of deferred maintenance and deferred construction as a result of the moratorium. I am now not in favor of doing this needs assessment at this particular moment in time, especially in light of the federal dollars we've received through the ESSER program and likely to be additional funding from the federal government from an infrastructure program. I think our focus now should actually be trying to make some progress on improving our facilities. I think if we did a needs assessment now, almost by definition, it would be outdated because districts are about to move forward, I would predict, at a period of significant facility improvement as a result of this federal funding. So I think it would almost be a better use of our time in terms of an assessment to do it after this 3-year period, after many of these improvements are about to be made. Yesterday, I brought forward a specific proposal that again emerged under the House 315 conversation around how I think we could help districts use those funds. There's basically 2 strategies there. One is to have the agency contract out for sort of a facilitator, if you will, an expert that could help districts coordinate the use of their funding with Efficiency Vermont and the agency's administration of the ESSER funds and so forth. And we found the Efficiency Vermont strategy sort of in this function to be particularly successful relative to indoor air quality. So that's what sort of gave me the kernel of the idea of how to approach this. As you know, we cannot direct school districts on how they spend their share of the ESSER funds, which is the larger share, the 90%. But we think it would be helpful to have some facilitation at the state level to help direct and coordinate the use of those funds. And then lastly, to establish a fund, $1 million for each of the 3 years, to assist those districts that might have larger projects or might not have sufficient funding from their local ESSER funding to address their facility needs. And then in section 4, there's several, I want to say, smaller items, and I just included some bullets on them, specifically the idea of doing a report, which I think is really useful. It's kind of what we've sort of been provoked, I think, by this whole conversation, is looking at what is the statutory framework, what is the regulatory framework, what are the policy objectives, and I think the agency would be in a good position to do that. So I think that's a great idea. The next two, the school facilities management certification capital improvement plan, I support both of these as well, though I do make a point that these are topics typically included in regulation in other states. And I sort of conclude my testimony with a bit of a conversation, if you will, on this idea of school district quality standards. Currently, our quality standards are largely focused on education and school level quality standards, not district quality standards. So typically, I think we'd envision, and what we've seen as a result of Act 46, that school districts are responsible for the maintenance of their facilities. And typically, these kinds of requirements, both for facilities management and capital planning, are included in those requirements of regulation. So I do support them. I think they should be imagined, if you will, in a broader regulatory framework. The limited service position in ESSER, as I've put forward already, I think that should be the contracting approach as opposed to an employee. The hiring process in state government is exceedingly slow. I'm afraid, particularly with the urgency around using the federal funds right now, that we'd lose some valuable time trying to attract someone. And we might do better both from a compensation and a timeline basis by contracting this out right now.
Secretary French, while we're on that, could you just say something about that challenge? Because I know we're talking about it a little bit this afternoon again with S114. And there must be, I suspect, some parallel paths sometimes. In other words, you're contracting, but also looking for a full-time person. Why is it easier maybe to find somebody to contract, work out to rather than a full-time position?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's and this is probably the most challenging area for me to articulate a more cogent response in, because I do see ultimately the quality of school facilities as central to education quality. Therefore, the state has a significant interest in this, and therefore the Agency of Education should have in-house expertise to manage this program. I would say typically my observation in the last 20 years or so is that expertise of the agency was mostly on administering the financial aspects of the program. There is an intersection certainly with the quality oversight of the contract proposals or the construction proposals with administering the funding. But as we've seen, as I point out in the regulations, there's never been a real emphatic inclusion of facilities quality in our regulatory construct from a education quality perspective. We talk about basic inputs in the system, but there's never been included before 19 or after 1997 or so an acknowledgement that school facilities are an important component of school quality. And I say 1997 because before 1997, we had a process that existed, like in many states, of what was called public school approval, where schools went through a formal certification process, not only for their educational programming, but also for their physical plant and so forth, to meet basic requirements to operate as a public school. So I think in this specific issue, it's really about this moment in time. We are already having conversations, as we had with Efficiency Vermont, to stand up the indoor air quality program. I don't think it was ever contemplated that the agency would hire someone to manage indoor air quality in the middle of a pandemic. We're still very much in the middle of the pandemic, albeit sort of this last phase of recovery. And there's an equal amount of urgency, I think, at this moment to ensure the funding's there and that people can coordinate the delivery of services and so forth. The agency's capacity right now, I think rightfully, is focused on all these new financial programs that we're having to manage that are highly technical, including ESSER. I think it would be challenging for us to stand up a new program in that context, in that same division, I think it would be comparable to our relationship with Efficiency Vermont that's worked quite well, that we would benefit from having that outside the perimeter of the agency right now, so we could focus on the administration and compliance requirements of the federal funding, and put someone out or an entity out into the field that could help coordinate things a little more flexibly. And that's sort of the other piece. Is I don't think we have a firm sense yet of how this program will evolve and what the need will actually be. As you know, we're asking districts to do that needs assessment right now. If we had a better understanding of the regulatory framework, which I think we've admitted today needs to be revised, if we had a better understanding of the statutory framework, I could then translate that into sort of a stable staffing request. We're in a very dynamic situation, I think, and again, the urgency that to me, I point to the idea that contracting would be a better approach at this moment.
Okay, thank you.
So the last piece, and it's sort of a conversation starter a bit on this idea of school district quality standards. Give you some history on that, we used to have this idea of school quality standards, and then in 2015 we shifted that to education quality standards, and these standards are in regulation, the state board's regulation. And we made that shift at the time, and I was a superintendent at the time. A lot of that conversation was around putting more emphasis on outcomes as opposed to inputs. But it's important to note at the same time that conversation was happening that we were also working on governance changes, and particularly Act 153 in 2010 included provisions, what were called virtual merger provisions. So Act 153 was a voluntary merger, if you want, as a school district, but it did force certain elements of education quality to be centralized at the supervisory union or district level. And a couple of the key ones related to education quality, such as curriculum and professional development, were required to be shifted to the supervisory union or supervisory district level, meaning that school districts would have responsibility for essentially the core school systems that relate to education quality. And that was a fairly recent innovation in Vermont. Prior to that time, schools on their own were responsible for their curriculum, and schools on their own were responsible for professional development. And certainly, part of Act 46 was a sort of a logic model that suggested that putting one school district in charge of multiple elementary schools, for example, could help the state address issues of persistent inequity, meaning that if one school board was supervising 3 elementary schools as opposed to 1, they'd be forced to confront the quality of the facilities among those schools. And I think it would be hard for them to justify one school having substantially better facilities than another. And unfortunately, that's all too often the case in our multi-district supervisory unions, when even in one school system, if you will, you can find significant variations in the quality of educational facilities, precisely because different boards were in charge of those buildings. So at any rate, I point to Massachusetts again as a model. Poor Massachusetts has been used a lot in our school construction conversations. But I point to their school quality framework, if you will, and it is a school district quality framework. In my written testimony, I observed that they envision, and I would say this is fairly common in many states, a more comprehensive set of standard domains, if you will, that includes, for example, leadership and governance. We don't have a standard for public school governance in our quality, which is surprising considering how important we believe local control to be to the quality of education at the local level. And the issue of governance has emerged quite quickly in our conversations on regulating independent schools. So we know it's a critical function, but we have no real regulatory expression of quality in statute or in our regulation. But in other states, it's considered an essential element. Curriculum instruction, assessment, human resources, professional development, a little more emphasis on human resources than we have professional development already in our sites, but human resources is not really mentioned in our regulatory framework. And I think increasingly this will be an area that's going to need our focus. We're as a result of our demographic challenges, I think we know there are staffing shortages across the economy. And I'm not convinced that COVID-19 has been the best recruitment tool for educators, and particularly with pension reform. I think districts are really going to be challenged in the future on recruitment issues. So there needs to be some attention to quality in this area. And we know a lot of districts operate schools with staff under provisional licensing and so forth. So this is an area that's going to need further attention. And this last bullet of financial and asset management, this is where capital planning, maintenance of facilities, and so forth fall. So Massachusetts is an example of another state that envisions all these elements sort of being sort of the domains of quality. And I would say if you compare that to our sort of conceptualization of this, that you will see ours is much more narrowly focused on issues of curriculum instruction and doesn't really include many of the operational aspects. So I just I point that out to you that, yes, I support those ideas in 426. I think it's part of a larger regulatory conversation that includes revisiting the statutory framework as well as the regulations for things like the capital outlay formula. And I think a good starting point if you're looking for a specific place to start from a statutory standpoint, I point to 16 VSA 165. That still more or less puts the quality focus on schools, not districts, even though Act 46 has sort of fundamentally shifted that. But also to include further description in the law, I think would be helpful to basically force the regulatory framework to be more broadly addressing all the areas of quality as envisioned by Massachusetts and other states. So that was more of this last section of my testimony is just more of a conversation sort of carryover from our conversation yesterday, but I promised you a little bit more on that and wanted to include some thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Committee, questions for Secretary French? Senator Persley.
I did have a question about part of the test. I think it was in section 2 part where you talked about the elementary schools. I don't know if I followed exactly what you were saying, and I read it and I still wasn't clear. But maybe I was trying to do several things at once. So maybe if you could just say what you're.
Yeah, if we compare it to our current school construction standards and sort of the statutory framework, doesn't envision any policy requirement really. It basically says if you want to build or do a project that qualifies as construction, you can submit a proposal, and if you can get through that process, you will receive 30% reimbursement for the project. I mean, that's it in a real nutshell. It doesn't really begin to suggest that the state has an interest in facilities and saying, well, what should be the priorities? Should we be putting 30% of construction aid in anybody who comes forward and asks for that? Should there be some consideration, for example, in my old district where there are 3 K-8 schools within 10-mile radius of each other, should there be some analysis from the state's perspective? So that kind of, I gave you some examples there, and I think, just based on my travels and largely, 15 years in the kingdom, but also working statewide, that I believe that small schools will always be in our landscape necessarily. I mean, to deliver education in remote communities, some say more rural communities. So there needs to be some policy emphasis on that, as opposed to saying, become efficient, small school, get as efficient as you can, right? And cut everything until your tax rate comes down at some point. And this is represented, I think, in our commitment in the small schools grant. We need to understand that that's going to be required, and we need to make a way for that to work financially. I would just suggest that from an educational perspective, a strong rationale could be made at the elementary level for that. It's harder for me to rationalize from an education policy perspective why we would allow high schools with 30 students in them, that kind of thing. Whereas a small elementary school, because of the need to focus on literacy and getting kids off to a good start, and the fact that the school probably needs to be geographically much closer to those students, I think we should just acknowledge that in policy and prioritize that. Right. So when an application came forward, we would say, okay, does it meet these criteria? To what extent does this fit in with the sort of the state's prioritization of construction of facilities?
Right, because in the past there hasn't been any of that. That hasn't been part of the application.
That's correct.
Process. So you're suggesting it should be. Okay, I agree with that.
Yeah, and so the conversation from an advocacy standpoint is really, we've been just trying to get this ball moving on school construction. As you know, there's been a moratorium. So the idea of doing a needs assessment just to get something happening. But I just continue to make the observation, particularly coming out of Act 46, that there should be, I think, some policy criteria put on the front end of construction. And I see construction and school facilities as being integral to education quality.
Okay. And Chair, if it's okay,
Please.
I agree with raising the threshold on the bidding. 15,000 is pretty low, given the amount of work that it takes to go out and get bids. But on the employee versus contractor, I also wonder if you've looked at, or what you think of, kind of expanding STEMP further, because as a state, we build up the state energy management program, not the old school energy management program, but basically creating STEMP to say that they're do both, since they're already becoming experts in buildings, they're state buildings, but they have the engineers and the knowledge on how to do bidding and how to do energy contracting and all this stuff. What about like creating a new position there that's just focused on education buildings and schools, and kind of, maybe even, sometimes is over at AOE to, just help with the coordination? Has that come up at all?
Yeah, I think it does. And it really speaks to sort of this dynamic we're in right now with COVID. COVID has accelerated a lot of issues in education that I would say we've just talked about. For example, I would say, in spite of my history, and I think Senator Campion knows as being a technologist in education, COVID-19 has brought us light years forward in technology and education, K-12 education. Not all good, but it's advanced it in a way that we probably never would have achieved without it. So we need to consider that. But I think it's also brought state agencies closer together. We're working much more on an integrated basis, and particularly with a rural state, I think it's absolutely necessary. But this issue of expertise on facilities, again, I will admit, I think we could understand that being necessary and a significant commitment on part of the state. So therefore, it should be represented in the agency staffing pattern. My thinking is we have this immediate need in front of us again to staff ESSER, to get the funds flowing, to help districts establish our priorities. And we're going to need some help facilitating that work. I certainly would like to see, if we're strategic about this, out the other end of that process, to see the agency grow its capacity to take this on a more permanent basis. But I think it also does require the statutory framework to evolve, the regulation framework to evolve. And that's why I think in 426, we have some movement in those areas. We also have a requirement for the agency to produce essentially a white paper on what's going on. So I think all those are important elements. I wouldn't want to settle on a staffing pattern right now based on a technical analysis without understanding the immediate tactical environment that we're in, which is really about COVID-19, this once in a lifetime opportunity to use the one-time funding to make sure districts are in a position, whatever they need, because they're sort of in the driver's seat to a large extent. They control the bulk of the funding, but they're also doing that needs assessment right now. And I think if we're smart about this, we can bring those things together. But it would be premature, I think, to have sort of the agency come in with a person to sort of control that dynamic when it's really now by necessity, because they control 90% of the funding, but also because we really don't know the impact of COVID-19. It has to be driven from the grassroots up, so to speak, and we need to help facilitate that. And then at some point say, okay, here's the pattern of work. Let's bring the policy framework online, and now we can come up with a staffing pattern to ensure this can go forward.
Okay, thanks.
Senator Lyons.
Thank you. I mean, it just sounds like everything has to happen at once, as usual. But so, yeah, I mean, this is difficult when all the resources are in one place, and maybe the standards, the quality standards and ideas for best practice is in another place. So I guess my question is, for this bill, what would you recommend in terms of trying to move everything forward, but also to provide some of the agency guidance that you're talking about? I mean, obviously Massachusetts has its own set of criteria. I don't know that Massachusetts completely fits with Vermont, but the round peg in the square hole or vice versa. But so the question about what are you thinking that might work for Vermont?
Yeah, thank you. I'd point to the language I shared yesterday on 315, which I referenced today. Yeah.
I first, let me apologize. I was unable to be here for that
Oh.
testimony, so I will catch up.
That's fine. And it is, we use the phrase analysis paralysis. Things are so complex in front of us right now. But then again, it can be reduced down to some simplicity in terms of how do we move forward. And for me, I just come back to the money. We have unprecedented one-time funding in front of us. And not to say, particularly ESSER funding, ESSER funding can't be used for any school construction project. Everything still has to be tied back to COVID. But fortunately, many of the issues there are precisely the ones we have in our schools. They pertain to indoor air quality, safety, and health considerations. All those things dovetail perfectly with ESSER funding. So my point is the opportunities in front of us. Let's try to maximize the use of those funds in this area if we can. And we've already seen, even from the indoor air quality piece, I would say dipping our toe in the water, so to speak, we had difficulty putting enough money out there to do those projects, for a number of reasons. I mean, there's a limited number of contractors. It does take planning. But we also have related issues, as you know. We've addressed lead in drinking water to a certain extent. That program has slowed down a bit due to COVID. We have PCBs in front of us, and in the intersection between those two issues comes back to indoor air quality, which is the ultimate measure of sort of how these things manifest themselves to a large extent in the school facility. So I just would observe, in spite of we understand the complexity in front of us and how to move forward, but on a simple side of things, we have this opportunity in front of us, and let's try to manage it the best we can to address those needs. And once that's done, hopefully we come out the other end of it with a better understanding of what our approach should be, not just Massachusetts, but what our approach should be in Vermont. And also to one of the charges, I think in 426, to have the agency sort of lay out this white paper and to look at possible funding sources going forward. I think the key there is not only to come up with a magic source of revenue, which no one has, or else someone would have done it already, but to intersect that with what our policy priorities are as a state. Again, the demographic challenges are still very real. They were there before COVID. Those are increasingly going to manifest themselves in staffing issues for schools. And it's more than just finding a body. It's really about finding high quality personnel to do the work across the state. And we need to acknowledge that as part of the operating environment in terms of our facilities, and putting that together, I think, to do that sort of white paper while we're doing this other work would be really useful.
So, I mean, along those lines, what we have identified during COVID is also kind of the significant healthcare and mental health care needs within schools. And this committee did work on the after school program with, and some of the work that'll be going on summer and fall. But as capital construction goes forward, does it make sense to consider those sort of in-house healthcare related issues? And I don't know whether ESSER funds are available to make some special little nurse's office or what kind of, that, or counseling rooms. And then the other one that I think of with COVID, and you mentioned it, obviously, is broadband and technology.
Yeah, I was going to mention that as well. I'm going to add more complexity to the picture, but
may as well.
Yeah, why not, right? So we deploy broadband to small schools through a spoke and hub model. I mean, and that's what we call wide area network. So there's usually one big pipe of bandwidth coming into a district, then spokes are run out to the schools. And that's how we keep small schools viable from a technology standpoint. They can't really do that on their own. They need to be part of a network. But I think coming back to sort of that policy criteria conversation again, if we make a commitment, and I'll throw Finland in here, we talked about Massachusetts. If we want to get kids off to a good start, we have to acknowledge that's a healthcare conversation as much as it is an education conversation. We have to have a commitment to natal care and so forth. In my sort of outline I provided you today, talking about elementary schools being near students, we could envision those, I think, being community learning centers, being near students at those important critical years, and envisioning sort of the community schools concept or integrated service delivery really being intersected. Again, the policy priority of the state becomes, we need to get these kids off to a good start. Schools provide that infrastructure that's probably out in the landscape already to do that, but we need to think about what does that modern small elementary school look like? And this is kind of the conversation, the fun conversation we were having with the architects in the last couple of years. It's not about, putting a new roof on an 18th century schoolhouse. It's about what is a community learning center look, or what should it look like? What does it need? Does it need a nurse's office? Does it need a dental area? Does it need places for family, so all that kind of visioning needs to occur, and that's where the prioritization, I think, is going to be successful for Vermont if we can do it. It's not about just picking up the Massachusetts standards, but I think we need to interject that policy conversation into the front end of it and help that drive the limited resources that we have available. We also don't have the tax base in Massachusetts, so it's also probably more critical that we prioritize that than they have done. It's just add more complexity, but I think the starting point is, to me, is still the funding we have available right now. I wouldn't want to miss out on the opportunity to leverage these funds to sort of let the system evolve down those paths and be attentive to the opportunities that might emerge from that work.
Thank you.
Other questions for Secretary French? Mr. Secretary, so in reading this, there are several suggestions that for us to consider in terms of amending this bill. Anything else that you want to mention?
No, I try to be constructive in my feedback to you, especially at this point in the process. Not to say I don't try to do that always, but I've tried to provide specific recommendations. I think a takeaway, I think, would be on the needs assessment. Again, I understand the trajectory of this bill. I've been involved in its trajectory to try to bring this conversation forward last year and this year. I really can't help but question the idea of doing a needs assessment now when we're about to do a bunch of work, even without state facilitation. That's about to happen. So I'd strongly recommend putting a pause on the needs assessment until this period of significant investment and improving our facilities is over. But I do appreciate the 426 emphasis on the policy and regulatory frameworks, because I think we need to. That's the piece about capturing the themes and ideas that are about to emerge from this work. And I think we'd be in a good position to have the agency produce that sort of recommendation for you.
Senator Hooker?
Thank you, Senator Campion. And Secretary French, just to clarify the idea of the needs assessment and the information that you'll be getting from the districts that will inform what's necessary. And are you saying that we look at that, we use the federal funding to accommodate those needs, and then the needs that are beyond that? Because when you're talking about 3 years out, I'm thinking, well, this money's gone, and then what do we do?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's just to be clear, there's a needs assessment concept in this bill that's really doesn't have its origins in COVID-19. It has its origins sort of this policy initiative. How do we deal with this backlog of school construction issues? Let's do a needs assessment. Let's go around the state, have it professionally done so the same standard is used to evaluate safety and health of safe and healthy issues, but also looking at 21st century learning environments. So we have some understanding of what's out there. And that, I think there's a $2.5 million appropriation recommended in 426. My point is, I would not do that right now. I'd rather focus on districts spending their ESSER funds to actually do some of the work, which we know is out there. So, I mean, the needs assessment would be useful to a certain extent, but districts, I would argue, are about to through their own activity under ESSER, about to address many of those issues. So when I was speaking earlier about the needs assessment under the recovery planning framework that we're having districts do it, that's where I think the confusion is, and I apologize for not making that direct connection. In our recovery planning framework right now, we're asking districts to do a needs assessment relative to their conditions in 3 focus areas to understand what's the impact of the pandemic on kids. That's not necessarily focused on facilities. That's about the social emotional status of kids, their academics, and their to what extent they're engaged with their schools, truancy, and so forth. So we need to understand the impact on kids. That's going to be a focus of the district sort of work in their planning to focus on kids. The idea though with the funding is that they're going to have significant funding available. They already, under ESSER 3 in particular, districts have significant funding from the federal government. It's largely to be focused on recovery. But they're going to be in a great position to address facility needs, which are an allowable use of these funds that are sort of beyond the scope of our immediate needs assessment that we're doing relative to the impact on kids. But they're going to be able to focus on things like safe and healthy considerations in their facilities. So we want to support them in that work as we get past this sort of initial needs assessment on the impact of students. But that's separate from the needs assessment that's envisioned in 426.
But it seems as if by knowing that and the district's using the ESSER money to do the facilities improvements that they can do, that it would cut down on the needs that are left over for us to consider, down
Right,
the road.
and that's sort of my point, is that let's put the emphasis on getting that funding move. I mean, just to break it down into steps. Right now, we're looking at what the impact on students is appropriately. You got to put that front and center. But as we get past that in the next couple of months, districts are going to be digesting this large tranche of federal dollars, and it's multi-year investment. And facilities are one of the allowable uses, particularly as it pertains to safe and healthy concerns. That's a sort of a longer term prioritization. That's where we're recommending that the agency be given some funding to contract out a facilitator to help bring that work together for districts. Because I think, as you know, there are districts that are going to have no problem coming up with a plan to address their facilities or their plan to address student needs, but they're going to be those districts that don't have the capacity even to do the planning. And that's where the state facilitation is exceedingly useful. I think is it's part of that equity piece, is like to make sure all districts are moving forward in these critical areas.
Thank you.
Senator Persley.
Secretary French, in your written testimony and the end part, the moving towards school district quality standards, I wondered if you you made some comments in there about revising and expanding the current regulations. And so I wondered, and you talked about what Massachusetts does. Are you thinking that would be something we talk about in 426, or are you just kind of putting that out as a marker for some future date that we'd have that discussion in a separate, maybe even a separate year?
Yeah, I was talking with the chair. I in particular wanted to start to sort of talk about a larger strategic sort of piece of work. And it came up yesterday. I think the question was more like, what did I think about the role of the state board? And I tried to sort of say it's not really for me about the state board. It's looking at this regulatory framework. And I think it is important that we, sort of complete that piece of work under Act 98, certainly about roles and who does what. But my commentary today is not really about who does it. It's just like what should be that work, I think, before us as a state. And I think it is important to point to the statutory framework relative to the regulation in this area in particular. But I think it's critical work, particularly post Act 46, that we sort of, Act 46 took all sort of the glamour, if you will, and energy. But governance to me has always been a means to an end, not in the end itself. And I think we have to look at issues of the quality and equity. I think I always use those two words hand in hand. How best, and I see this as the essential state responsibility, how do we ensure high quality and that all students have access to that high quality statewide? And if we play out school construction as sort of symptoms of some of the problem, it's precisely because the regulatory framework in this area hasn't been active. The moratorium and our outdated regulations, that we have seen a widening gap in the quality of school facilities and opportunity in the state. So it's, I won't say failure, but it's because the state regulatory framework has not been an active player in the environment that this equity gap has occurred. So, I just include someone now working in state government, that the role of the state is to ensure that equity. And it's when the regulations and statutory construct are not working as actively as they should, that those that can shall build good schools, and those that can't figure out how to do it won't. And the state has a role in enacting quality across the entire state.
But do you think it should be part of, it sounds like the answer would be no. You don't think this is a discussion for 426, this bill that we have, that this
Right.
is for a future conversation?
It's a bigger conversation. These would be themes I would try to draw out a bit in that white paper that's included in 426. Some idea of how to sort of pull these things together. And I think, not to harken on Act 46 again, but the front of Act 46, I think, really started to describe what would be educational policy goals for the state in the next 50 years. Doesn't, not to speak to the governance piece, but just so what are those goals? And I think it's sort of considering how to operationalize those goals more emphatically in the governance structure is sort of the next piece of work in front of us.
Okay. Anything else, committee? So Ms. Wasserman, do you have I'm sorry, Senator Hooker, please.
I do have a question going back to the capital outlay financing formulas that are supposed to be looked at every year. And you mentioned that they hadn't been updated in 8 years. And I'm just wondering why.
I think the chair made that comment. My observation as a sort of being on the receiving end of this is because there's been a moratorium. The moratorium on school construction aid was enacted 2007, 2008, somewhere in that time frame. So, my guess is they haven't been reviewed due to the changes in the board, but the fact that there was no active school construction program essentially for the last 15 years.
Well, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
So Ms. Wasserman, you have this document. I'm wondering if you could pull together for the committee by Friday, if it were work for you, some decision points. In other words, pull out what Secretary French is looking for us to, how he's looking for us to amend this based on the memo and anything else you may have heard, as well as if there are senators, I think perhaps Senator Perchlik, you might want to work with Ms. Wasserman on some language as well, so that on Friday we can just go through, take a look at what we have and some of the decision points we need to make before moving this back to the floor and then back to the House. Are you comfortable with that, Becky?
So you're not looking for language necessarily, just
You can do it however you would like. I mean, language would be fine actually for us. I mean, we don't need like a separate document. I don't see what Secretary French is proposing as, I don't see anything as very controversial. So I would suspect most of it would end up, I don't want to speak for the committee, but a lot of it would end up in the bill. So perhaps language, and then any language that maybe Senator Perchlik or others have at this point, we could take a look at all of it on Friday.
So I think some of it I can put into language. So I think actually scheduling wise, I'm probably not available on Friday to do it, but I could do it for tomorrow afternoon or I can figure out the scheduling, but some of it is I can easily put into language. I think some of it is a little more complicated. For example, there's a suggestion of the statutory framework for school construction aid to be updated. That's a pretty heavy lift. So that would require a lot. And I think it's also, I think that is more of a decision point discussion, because a lot of this bill is looking at sort of assessing what's needed in schools and looking at how to fund it, with the ultimate goal of establishing or reestablishing a program for how to do construction aid through the state, if possible. So updating a program right now without, I guess, a funding source, I think I think that's a policy question of, I don't know what direction you're going with the bill. Is the bill looking at sort of setting the path to be able to have a program, or actually creating a program? And I understand there's some distinction here between what the secretary was saying about use of helping schools use their ESSER funds to do
Right.
the more health and safety related projects. I
Mhm.
think there's also a lot of other construction projects that were done through the school construction aid program. So it's almost like there's two separate paths that you could take or do both at the same time. So I think that is more of a decision point. But I think by tomorrow or Friday, trying to redo the statutory framework
Sure,
for the aid program would be difficult.
sure. Yeah, no, certainly, that's not the expectation here. But yes, if you could take, and maybe it is another way to look at it, really are some of the decision points that we need to make as it relates to what we've heard. And if you want to put those in statutory language, that if that would help you, that would be great. Secretary French, do you want to add anything based on what Ms. Wasserman just said?
Yeah, I would agree. I just sort of wanted to put that on your radar as being
Yeah.
a bigger scope of work. But I would say also just refer you back to the piece we did on 315. If you're looking for specific language on how to sort of do the ESSER appropriations, if you will, we spent some time sort of on our legal team putting that together, so that's available for your use. But I would agree, some of this is just sort of to admire the larger scope of work that's involved in this landscape.
So I can frame it as the sort of two paths right now of having the language in the bill that was proposed for 315 of how do you work with the school districts to implement what their construction projects that have to do that are related to health and safety needs due to COVID, and
Mhm.
have that contracting sort of position, and then leave in the language for right now this needs assessment that I think touches on some of that, but maybe also touching on more areas of the kinds of school needs that schools have right now. And so that would just be a decision point for the committee if you want to do both or just one or the other.
Right. And I think that sounds fine. And I think what I'd like is if you could just get it to us by tomorrow or Friday, and come in on Tuesday, and Jeannie will put you on the agenda for Tuesday. I think I just, for one, just need to see some things, a couple of paths, a couple of options, and what different things have been floated, just so I can get my head around everything. And I think maybe that'll help committee members as well. And then, Jeannie, can you put Ms. Wasserman on the agenda for Tuesday to come back in and?
Certainly.
Okay, and take us through some of these? How does that sound to you, Becky?
That sounds great. I can do
Okay,
that.
committee, does that sound okay? Okay, all right. And I know Senator Perchlik will probably be working with you a little bit on some language. Okay.
Great.
Thank you. So Secretary French, if we could transition, you and we talked a little bit in this committee with Jim Demaray and Mr. Carroll around a path forward for some language, reworking some of the roles, duties, responsibilities of the State Board of Education. And as I believe I mentioned to you, we have a possible vehicle on that that is leaving government operations. And I don't know if you and Mr. Carroll have had an opportunity to talk about that. What I'd hoped would happen is perhaps the two of you could come together and have a conversation and see if what has been proposed, it works for you. And I don't know if Mr. Carroll is still there or not, but go ahead, Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some conversation. Again, largely my characterization based on where we ended up on I think it was S166 last year.
Last year, yeah.
Yeah, and I talked about sort of that negotiating process. I honestly haven't paid a lot of attention to the sort of new version of this in GovOps, and I can definitely heat that up and have that more direct conversation with the chair and the state board to give you, I mean, in this condensed moment of time, my perspective and see if we can have consensus perspective on what's doable right now. I would just observe it is a bigger piece of work
Yeah.
that's worthy of some deliberation. So I wouldn't have been surprised this session to see it start to emerge immediately. But I also wasn't surprised to see COVID-19 sort of overtake all the energy in the room, so to speak. So
Yes, and just to be clear, and you're refreshing my memory from your comments yesterday, I don't think anybody on the committee wants you to redirect your focus away from the pressing priorities that you're dealing with. So, and I, these are things that we can get to, if you will. But if there is any bandwidth at any point for the
yeah,
two of
no,
you,
I'm just saying it hasn't been on my radar per se, but
or should it? I think
Yep.
it popped up. Senator White proposed again that there's this vehicle, and this committee thought, okay, if it were to work, I know Senator White is looking for our endorsement or for us to say, hey, let's put on the brakes. And I'm more than comfortable following your lead and Mr. Carroll's lead on this, given everything else that is on your plate right now.
yeah,
I don't
and
want
I would.
all of a sudden the headlines say
Yeah.
Campion said to work on this and not this.
Yeah. No, and I also don't want a headline saying Secretary French uses COVID-19 again as an excuse for not getting things done, right? Because I've been very careful not to do that. I just, I at heart, I'm a pragmatist, so I really enjoy sort of the larger philosophical agreements and disagreements I have with Chair Carroll. And I look forward to having that sort of larger geopolitical conversation. But from what I'm hearing from you is that you'd like us to react to the specific proposal that's before GovOps. And I'm happy to put on sort of my pragmatic hat and see if we can come to some construction.
I think we lost you there for a moment, Mr. Secretary.
Frozen for me.
Yeah, frozen.
Some of his thoughts on that piece. And, again, it's a much smaller conversation, which is easier for us to sort of find agreement on as well, if you want to make progress on that this session. But let me work on that and get back to you fairly quickly. I'd say by next week at the latest.
Yeah, and we did lose you there for just a moment. You froze. So I just want to make sure that we got everything that you said. Is it possible for you and Mr. Carroll to also coordinate a little bit and have a conversation? Sure. Okay, that would be great. That would be great.
Well, I think it's more useful to you if we can at least identify where we have agreement and where we don't. So I will reach out to Chair Carroll on the specific piece of GovOps is working on and see if we can move that forward for you.
Great. Excellent. Mr. Carroll, would you like to add something?
Mr. Chairman?
Please.
Yeah, this is John Carroll. I was listening in, but unable to activate my my mic. So I did share with the Secretary last week the draft that I furnished to you all last Thursday. And so I'm sure that the Secretary and I will find time, perhaps in the next 24 hours, to chat over the phone about this and find our areas of mutual agreement and any concerns that he may have, and maybe jointly we can give you a written response or meet with you perhaps on Friday afternoon if you'd like.
Sure. I was actually going to ask Jeannie if it works for the two of you a week from Friday.
Okay.
If that works for the two of you, knowing that, just to give you some more space and time to think about.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. I don't have that direct control of my calendar right now, but a week certainly is doable.
Is that okay? Jeannie, does that work?
Fine.
I just want to make sure Jeannie is capturing this.
And what I'll do, since John's here, I'll have our staff reach out to schedule a time for you and I to sort of get together on that.
Right.
And then we'll be prepared to have a conversation with you next week, or at least I'll be on that then. So
Thank you.
I apologize for being behind on this.
No, please, no apologies necessary. And again, if either of you feel that this needs to be postponed, given everything else going on, please just let us know. But for now, we'll just have Jeannie hold a spot next Friday for this conversation. Great.
I've made a note of that.
Great. Terrific. Thank you. Okay. Anything else, Mr. Chairman, that you want to add?
No, thank you, Senator Campion and committee. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, anything else?
No, I think I'm in tomorrow again. So
You are, so
look
it's-
forward to seeing you again tomorrow.
Yeah, and just
3
so you
days in a
know,
row.
what would be helpful, I think, in general is, just maybe talk a little bit about some of your, this is again for those watching, Secretary French's confirmation conversation, hearing, some of the things that you particularly are proud of that you've accomplished during your time, and just going forward, what are some of the big goals? I know that would be something that's a way to kick off the conversation, and then I know everybody will be up late coming up with tough questions for you. So if you could just, we'll plan on you coming in, maybe, I don't know. I don't think it'll take more than 3 hours.
Oh, good. I was thinking it would be much longer. That's great.
No, we're really looking forward to it. So
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.
yeah, it should be great. Okay. Okay, committee, why don't we reconvene in about 10 minutes, take a little stretch, and then we'll